Tonight, we are going to be discussing what is season extension, why would you want to extend your garden season, some strategies for season extension, some of the materials and building, some of the materials and how to build some different components to season extension. And then Brendan's going to show a little demonstration on how to send hoops for low tunnels. And then which crops should you grow and when should you grow them? All right, so in a nutshell, season extension is any structure or material that allows the crop to be grown out of its normal growing season. So this could be a variety of materials. Here we see pictured this material called remay. And what remay does is it holds heat inside of the hoop. In this picture, it's the middle of the day, and it's a warm day, and so the hoops allow us sometimes to pull up the sides in order to allow excess heat to evacuate the area. And so season extension allows for a quicker maturity and higher quality under adverse weather conditions. Brendan, you want to add anything?
No, I'm sure we'll get into it.
Great. Okay. And so the why of season extension. We want to be able sometimes to harvest earlier in the spring and later in the fall. We also sometimes want to protect crops from the extremes, like we said before, so from extreme heat and rain. And also we want to be able to grow some more of our garden varieties for longer periods of time. And Brendan's going to kind of touch on some succession planting methods that you can incorporate in your garden. We also want to garden in the cooler months. And eating fresh produce year-round is a really great way to enhance your diet and your family's diet. And so by using season extension methods, you'll be able to grow into the later fall and sometimes even the winter and get your spring garden started a little bit earlier. And then as far as farmers go, they want to see an increased revenue. So by using season extension methods, they'll be able to grow more produce in months where they may not be able to grow some of your warmer season crops like tomatoes.
I will say for this, particularly on the farmer's part, this is one of the things that I really enjoy about season extension for the home gardener is a lot of these are techniques that are used by production farmers, and so the idea of just downscaling those, bringing them home, it really adds a lot to your gardening. It's a really fun way to increase your season and have fresh veggies for longer, and there's just a lot of cool technology involved with it that farmers are using right now. The main principle behind season extension is, plants don't need to be at 70 degrees all the time to grow. And there's a lot of plants, and we'll get into some types of vegetables that can grow at fairly low temperatures and actually taste better at lower temperatures. But when you're talking about season extension, it's this kind of game of degrees. If you're getting into winter, what you really want to avoid is long, hard freezes that are going to kill your plants. And really the best way to avoid that is to just raise the temperature a couple degrees. So if you can create this protected area, even if the outside temperature drops to 28 degrees, if you can keep it around freezing inside, 33 degrees inside, reduce the length of time that it's below freezing for, it only takes a little bit to get that plant through the night, and then once the sun comes up, it's good to go. So, choosing plants that can survive that kind of cold, brassicas, your cabbages and your broccolis we'll talk about, and, making sure that you're planting throughout the summer into the fall and that you're timing the right kinds of plants for the right time of year and just keeping them from that killing cold.
Yeah, and an example of some of those crops that do better once frost hits them would be things like collards and kale. They tend to get a little bit sweeter after frost has hit them. All right, so strategies we're going to discuss for season extension include mulches, raised beds, row covers, cloches, cold frames, high tunnels, and green covers. All right, so first things first, mulches. This is a very simple, low-tech method that you can use to moderate your soil temperatures. So in the winter, they're great to kind of make sure the soil temperature is kind of an even temperature, and it helps prevent the ground from freezing too much. And then certain mulches can raise temperatures early in the season. For example, on the bottom of the slide, we see an example of black mulch. And black mulch is a really great way to heat up the soil earlier in the season, and you can plant crops like potatoes, peppers, and eggplant to help give them a head start earlier in the season when the temperatures outside are a little bit colder. So mulches also encourage plant growth. They can retain moisture. They also prevent weed growth, which is a plus in any garden. And they also have the ability to prevent insects and disease. An example here on the top right is a picture of reflective mulch. And the reflective mulches are really cool because they can disrupt insects, and they confuse them by giving light in areas, especially underneath the leaves, where there may not be light, where a lot of insects like to hide. And so by using that reflective material, the sunlight will hit the reflective mulch and bounce underneath of the leaves, and therefore confusing the insects. Brendan, do you have anything else about that?
Yeah, and these, this is a great example of something that's widely used by farmers because there are so many benefits that it can give to growing. The weed control, disease control, everything that Angela mentioned. Using these kind of mulches gives you so much benefit and can really increase the quality and yield of what you're growing.
I'm sure you guys have, if you've grown tomatoes, you have experienced septoria leaf spot. So that is a soil-borne disease, and so if we're using mulches, we can lessen the incidence of septoria, and that can be an issue. It doesn't kill the plant outright, but it lessens the growth and the output of the tomato fruit.
And we had a question from Dan about is mulching as effective in maintaining soil temperatures in raised beds? And yes, absolutely. The preferred method that farmers use is to actually raise large soil beds as they're laying the mulch over them. And I even use it in my home garden, which is just for your kind of standard wooden box raised bed. You can staple it down to the sides and get all the same benefits that you would when using it in open field.
Next, we're going to talk about raised beds. Brendan, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so raised beds, since we're on that topic. Any garden bed that elevates the growing area above the surrounding soil, and this plays right into your raising soil temperatures. By being up above the ground, it's going to absorb sunlight from more sides, so you're going to get warmer soil earlier in the season, which is going to mean better germination for the plants that you put in there, better root growth early on. And there's a lot of ways to go about this, and we'll go into a few coming up here in the next couple slides.
Sure. Vanessa is asking, how high is too high for a raised bed?
So you can really, one of the advantages, and do you want to switch to the next slide? I think we talk about this a little bit. So one of the big advantages is actually being able to customize your height on raised beds, and I think the only thing that would make it too high is if it were uncomfortable for you to access. So if you do, if there's issues with limited mobility, knee pain, back pain, building a high raised bed is actually a great way to bring the soil up to your level and make it a lot easier to work with. The only thing you have to be aware of in those situations is that you're anchoring it properly, because if you have something that's kind of tall and top heavy, you don't want it to, get knocked over. And you want to make sure that the sides are well supported so that they don't bow out under the weight of soil. But yeah, you can easily bring these up to waist height or stomach height if, you want to avoid bending over them. And the other advantages of these, you can really customize your growing mix. You get to decide exactly what's in here. So if contamination at your site soil is a problem, you can make your own mix. And they are going to warm up faster, so you're going to get that early germination. And based on the mix that you've made, you're going to get better water regulation than most soil in the ground. So if you're mixing in your perlite and your vermiculite, your peat moss, and you're going to have a soil substance, a growing medium that can really hold on to water when you need it, but not get saturated and soggy. So there's a lot of great advantages to this.
And that's a good point about soil contamination. It's always really important to test your soil, especially if you're growing plants in the ground and you're starting a new garden. You always want to make sure that you're starting off on the right foot and that you know how much nutrients that your plants are going to need. And a standard soil test from Rutgers will really only account for your nutrient levels. But if you live in a city, say, and you're concerned about soil contamination, you can make sure that your soil is being tested for heavy metal contaminants. So that's also very important.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about raised beds and the kind of materials that you can use for them. There's a bunch of different options for whatever kind of suits your budget and needs. If money is no object and you would like only the most beautiful of raised beds, then cedar is the way to go. It is very attractive, rot-resistant, lightweight, very easy to work with, but it is expensive, and it's a little softer in the wood terms than some of the other materials here. So make sure if you are doing longer cedar beds that you're giving the sides good anchoring. Again, be aware of the potential for bowing from that soil weight. Pressure treated, there's a little bit of controversy around pressure treated because in the past, pressure treated wood was made with arsenic, and there was evidence that arsenic could leak into the surrounding soil. Most modern pressure-treated wood, ever since the arsenic was done away with back in 2003, is made with a micronized copper, and it's rot-resistant. Whether or not it leaches is still kind of the jury is out on that. But again, any leaching is going to be copper leaching as opposed to arsenic. And if you're even in organic agriculture, copper is something that's commonly used as a fungicide. So, whether or not it's something that can hurt you, it's unlikely. Most plants, if they were to be exposed to too much copper, the plant would decline before you would ever get around to eating it. But if you are concerned about leaching and you want to use pressure treated, simply putting a sheet of plastic, like a plastic drop cloth or something, between the wood and the soil is a great way to make sure that there's no soil contact. And then you don't have to worry about that leaching issue. And you can just enjoy the other advantages of pressure treated, which are the fact that it's much more affordable than cedar. It's a highly durable and rot-resistant material. It's not the prettiest, and it is kind of heavy, but if your goal is just to get some garden beds in and start growing, then pressure treated is one of your more cost-effective materials. Plenty of other materials, landscape block. You can make some beautiful beds out of them. Even with landscape block, though, you might want to put a barrier between the soil and the block. Some of the cement-based ones can actually cause your soil pH to rise because they can lie into the soil. Galvanized steel is another great option. There's actually some very beautiful pre-molded galvanized raised bed kits out there. They can be vulnerable to damage. If you bang them up, they might get rusted and can become unattractive over time. And I think artificial wood right now is really an interesting area. Again, it's a little more expensive than some of the other options, but you can really, with some of the composite plastic boards that are available, you can basically pick and choose your color and grain texture and put together a really beautiful garden with that material. Again, if you do choose to use artificial wood, make sure you support it well because it tends to be a little more wobbly than normal boards, and you could get some distortion. So as for size of raised beds, so we already kind of talked about the height of them is really as high as you need them to be. Minimum of 6 inches is what you want. 12 is sort of ideal. Taller beds for more accessibility. The length and the width are up to you. Planning your raised beds around common board lengths is a good idea to minimize the amount of cutting that you're going to have to do. So most common boards are going to come 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot, 16 foot. So if you make that if you kind of build around that idea, then you're going to save yourself a few cuts and some wasted material. I personally am a big fan of the 3 foot wide beds. I find 3 foot wide is just enough for me to be able to reach to the far side. So you kind of get full accessibility without having to, walk all the way around back and forth too much.
One question I had from Vanessa, she was saying that she's worried about the chemicals of plastic as it deteriorates. And I had just made the comment that agricultural plastics that's used for mulches are pretty stable, and they don't leach, so they're safe to use in a garden or farm setting.
Yeah, and most of those, for the top mulches at least, you'll get them pulled up. If she's concerned about plastic as a barrier between the pressure treated, yeah, I mean, if you're worried about leaching there, then probably avoid pressure treated if that's your real concern, and go with something like cedar instead. So for raised beds, there's a lot of different methods depending on the materials and skill level that you have. So the great thing, though, is there's tons of plans out there. Most state extension websites have some plans of some form, and you can find a lot of folks on YouTube that can walk you step by step through your particular build. Some kind of universal concerns, though, if your ground has a lot of slope, you might want to make sure that you shovel and level off that ground surface so that you don't have a lot of runoff taking your soil out. And layering cardboard or newspaper at the bottom will help to kill off any grass or weeds, so you don't necessarily need to cut the sod out at the bottom. You lay that layer of cardboard, and then you can pile your soil on top of that. The cardboard will break down, but not before it takes care of your weeds. And if you have any problems with any, digging, groundhogs, anything you worry about coming up underneath, a layer of hardware cloth or a wire mesh laying in the bottom will help prevent critters from digging up underneath your raised beds. Anchoring systems, there's, for shorter raised beds, this isn't necessarily essential, but like I said, if you're doing a taller one for accessibility, you're going to want to make sure that the corners and sides are well anchored to keep it in place and keep it from bowing out. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this, but just keep in mind whatever material you choose is going to be in ground contact, so the potential for those stakes to break down over time is there. Wooden stakes, if you're going to use wooden stakes, going with hardwood stakes, something like locust would be ideal if you can find locust stakes. 4x4 posts work as well. Cedar is a good option there, or pressure treated. Galvanized poles, green U posts, this is an area where you can get a little creative too, but, just make sure that whatever you're using is okay for ground contact so that you don't put the stake in and then next year it's deteriorated. These anchors are going to help hold your bed in place. They're going to retain the form of the bed against the soil's weight, and it's going to give you something to hang fencing on in the future. As for filling the raised beds, we always like to say be careful with bagged and bulk soils because you don't necessarily know what you're getting with all of them. Your best case scenario for a fill is going to be vermiculite, peat moss, perlite. If you make your own compost, that's the best of all. Source in soil from your location, and add your own fertilizers if you've got leaf mulch that you can break down in there, and for deep beds, you're going to want to fill in the bottom before you get to your soil mix, or else it's going to cost you a whole lot more. So, old stumps, pieces of wood, leaf mulch, straw, newspaper, you can dump those in the bottom to kind of pack out the space before you put your growing medium in that top 8 to 12 inches.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea to make your own, if you can, soil media. So that way you can kind of customize it to your area. By using vermiculite, you're adding a lot of porosity to the soil. Peat moss holds soil moisture, and compost adds some of those micronutrients, and is just a really great resource. Turns into black gold, and that way you're also not adding to the waste stream. So you're keeping those kitchen scraps out of the trash system. Do you want to start talking about low tunnels and hoop houses?
So you can use these with raised beds, or you can use them on their own. In my garden, I use low tunnels with my raised beds. If you are going to use these low tunnels or hoop houses, basically what we're talking about here is a series of metal hoops with greenhouse film stretched over top, a plastic film that lets sunlight in. Remember, if you're using a system like this, that you will need to water your plants. Drip irrigation helps a lot with this since rain won't be directly falling on your plants. And these can be used for spring and fall season extension. And my experiment for this winter is I'm going to see how long I can keep growing for in the winter and try to get kale and whatever else I can, winter lettuce, going in my raised beds, and I'll let you know how it works out. But for very cold hardy vegetables like that, you can definitely keep your garden going year-round. When you're searching for the materials for this, you want to make sure that you're using plastic film that's specifically labeled as greenhouse film. You wouldn't want to like go out and get a tarp from Home Depot or something. Greenhouse film is going to give you the best light penetration, is going to be UV resistant, so it's not going to break down in the sunlight, and it's going to last you much longer than anything else. And one thing to be aware of, because you are covering up your plants in a plastic bubble, is the temperature in there can actually build up very quickly on a sunny day. So even if it's 30, 40 degrees outside, if you've got direct sunlight hitting that house on a cold day, it's going to heat up quick. So I use a thermometer, a Bluetooth thermometer. I'll go into a little more later. But keeping an eye on this to make sure that you're not cooking your plants on a sunny day, and then that lets you go out and pull up the plastic on the sides if you need to then. Anything else?
Yeah, I had a couple questions, but someone was asking about the soil, using the same soil in their raised bed, and whether they should use that same soil every year. And I had said, yes, you can use the same soil every year, but by adding things like compost, you're really going to enhance the soil and add some of those micronutrients that your plant needs.
And if you are reusing the growing medium, that's, more a topic for another talk, but make sure that you're practicing good rotation with your garden crops, that you're not growing the same thing in the same spot every year, or you're going to start to run into disease and pest issues building up in that bed. To make sure that you're rotating your plants, not growing the same thing in the same spot every year to avoid disease and pest issues from building up in that soil.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And as for the question about snow, if it ever snows in New Jersey again, which who knows at this point, but I keep my beds. I have about 1.5 feet between my raised beds. I would probably skip a bed for each tunnel to leave some good space in between. Just make sure you leave yourself enough that you can knock any snow that's building up on top off.
Yeah, and I think you have in a later slide talking about 2 feet apart for the hoops.
Yeah, keeping the hoop space 2 feet apart. Yep. Oh, yeah, as far as in the row, yes. But you're also, for these, I'm using galvanized steel posts. They're galvanized steel conduit for the hoops. So that gives you a good amount of structural integrity, and we'll get a little bit into that.
Okay, and Erin said that she already purchased a simple plastic sheet for her tunnel, and she's asking if it definitely won't work.
It's not that it won't work. I mean, you will still get something, but it's always about the amount of light that's getting through. And when you're buying something from a supplier that's labeled for plant purposes as a greenhouse film, it's going to tell you what percentage of light is going to get through. So it'll work. Some sunlight will get through. Your plant might not grow as efficiently as it would with greenhouse film. What you will probably see with the plastic sheet is that it's going to break down pretty quickly. So you might only get a season or two out of it before the sunlight, kind of makes it start to break apart on you. But you can use it if you already bought it. Here's
an example of one of your beds, right? Is this from the spring?
Yep, this was my pepper bed from the spring. I have this hoop house is built on a frame that's actually on hinges, so it can lift up from the raised bed to let me get inside and do whatever weeding or harvesting I need to do.
And I noticed that you put brackets for the hoops on the inside of your raised bed. Mm-hmm. And so that would probably help prevent from the wind or rubbing against those brackets.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you want to make sure that there's no sharp edges that your plastic's going to be rubbing up against because it'll tear pretty quickly. And yeah, having it mounted inside the frame like that makes that a very solid structure. I can take the hinges off that, lift that whole thing up, and walk around with it. It makes it very easy to move and store away.
I guess you want to mention you're using half-inch conduit, electrical conduit.
Yeah, so we'll have the demonstration video. I'll talk a little bit about that more. But yeah, half-inch galvanized conduit. They sell it in the electrical section at Home Depot. You can get a stack of 10 of them for fairly cheap. I highly recommend this over using PVC. PVC can actually chemically react with your greenhouse film and cause it to break down quicker. So using the galvanized steel, it gives you a sturdier structure, and it doesn't risk that breaking down.
And those brackets are 3/4 inch.
So you'll see right next to the conduit in the electrical section. So for half-inch galvanized conduit, you're going to buy the half-inch brackets, and they have them in little plastic bags right next to it. They snap right over and screw into the frame.
All right.
So then this is the other model of tunnel that I use on my longer beds. For this, you're spacing your hoops every 2 feet, and they can push right into the soil without much trouble. The last hoop on either end is going to be angled out at 60 degrees, and that's to help with the tension as you are kind of finishing off those ends. And once you have your plastic set up, you're going to gather and twist it up and basically make a rope out of it that you tie around the stake. Pull that back as far as you can and hammer it into the ground, and you're going to see that it puts tension over the entire system, and you get a very solid structure out of that. But what's also nice about this setup is it's very easy for me. I can just, if it starts to get too hot inside the tunnel, I can kick aside those logs, pull the side up, and vent out the hot air.
Yeah, it looks like something you have in your yard.
Yeah, it worked very well. I had great tomatoes this summer. That's the inside.
Your tomatoes, right?
Yep, that was back in early April. I put those guys in. So you've got the tunnel, you've got the drip irrigation inside the raised bed.
Yeah, and usually you would put tomatoes in uncovered, say mid-May.
Mm-hmm.
This year we did have a little bit late frost, so we were even saying, a week after Mother's Day. We usually say Mother's Day, but when you have something like this, you can put your tomato or your cold-sensitive crops in a little bit earlier, and you can have tomatoes earlier season as well. And
this tunnel did save me during that April frost. I walked out one morning, and there was ice on my cabbage. And I opened this tunnel up, and the tomatoes were as happy as could be. So this really works.
This is just a couple pictures of a couple master gardeners from a few years ago bending some hoops for low tunnels that we built out at the Earth Center. And next we're going to have...
Thank you, Dave.
Now I'm going to show you how to bend up a hoop for your hoop house. One of the first things you need to consider is the materials you're going to be using. I use half-inch electrical conduit that you can get at your local home improvement store. This is 10 feet long, and they come in those lengths. It's important to use the galvanized steel conduit instead of something like PVC. PVC can actually react with your plastic greenhouse film and cause it to degrade faster. For your greenhouse film, you can find this online. This roll came 10 foot wide by 100 feet long, and I use this to make both of my hoop houses so far, and there's enough left on the roll to probably make one or two more. My bender that I've used, I also purchased online. It's a little more expensive than some other garden equipment, but if you go in with maybe a few other gardening friends, it's about $60, so not too much of an investment. I've anchored mine to a stump that I have conveniently located in my garden, but a heavy picnic table or even a potting bench would work a little better and might mean a little less bending over when you're making these hoops. So I marked my hoop off at 16 inches, the halfway point of 5 feet, and 16 inches from the far end. First, I'm going to line this up with the little hoop on my bender. Then, simply bend around until you touch on the far side. Pull that out, spin it around, and line it up to the other 16-inch mark. Again, pull around until the hoop touches the bender. Now to finish it off, you're just going to line that halfway point mark up with the center bolt on your bender, and you're going to give these a squeeze just until they're parallel. It's fairly easy to adjust this material. And there you go. You have your first hoop for your greenhouse. These will slide easily into the ground with a little bit of pressure, and then you just have to stretch your film across.
Yeah, so Angela had mentioned this earlier under the name Remay. Floating row cover is another word for it. This is another great alternative for season extension. You can use this over hoops, or in the case of some plants, like the broccoli that's pictured here, you can lay it right down on top. This, again, in that game of degrees, this can sometimes be just enough to create that little air pocket that you need to turn a slightly freezing night into one that's survivable. It's great in a pinch if you just have a roll of this around and a sudden cold snap hits. You can run out and toss it over your plants real quick, and it can really save them. It lets sun and rain through, and so you don't have to worry about leaving it on a cold day. You know, your plants are still going to get sun. And it's also very good for pest deterrents, and you'll see a lot of different weights of this material are rated for certain amounts of sun that can get through, and some of the very light stuff is just labeled as insect netting. And especially for things like the white cabbage moths that lay the caterpillars all over your broccoli and cabbage and kale, this is one of the most effective ways of keeping them out of your garden.
Right, and you won't have to use as many pesticides in your garden. Another thing that it's good for is flea beetle. We have such an issue with flea beetle, you know, on our eggplant, and they also like arugula. So as soon as you plant something, you know that there's a pest issue out there. You want to make sure that you cover it with a floating row cover.
And just to give you an example of some of the different weights that are out there, you'll see these listed on gardening sites by weight. So you might see, you know, -15, -19, -30, 50, 70. That's how heavy and thick the material is. So customize for your particular need. The much lighter stuff isn't going to provide as much thermal protection, but will still keep out bugs well enough, and will let more light through. So like 85% light penetration for the 19 weight. If you live somewhere colder, if you're up a little further north, you know, North Jersey, New York State, and you get some really cold winters, you might want to opt for some of the 50 or even 70 weight. It's less light that gets through, but you get more protection out of it, and it can protect your plants of temperatures down to even 24 and even lower in some cases.
So another method you can incorporate in your garden are cloches. Cloche is a French term for bell. And you can see on the left-hand side, there is a glass bell-shaped form that you can just put directly over your plant, and that creates a greenhouse-like environment for the plant. Cloches are pretty neat, but they're really they're good for only one plant. So things like low tunnels will keep more plants covered, whereas a cloche will really only keep one plant covered. But if you need something in a pinch, you can use materials like plastic liter bottles of soda that have been cleaned out and the bottom has been cut, or even reused water bottles where, you know, you can cut the bottom, you can bury part of it in the ground, and for example, here you see a stake that's driven in through the top. That will help stabilize the cloche, and by leaving out the cap, you can help with venting, and so the plants won't totally bake. Another real low-cost example would be cold frames. Cold frames are really neat. They'll create a warm environment for your plants, like Brendan was saying earlier, similar to low tunnels in that they will help raise the temperature. You want to make sure that on a really hot day or a really warm day, you want to vent the cold frame. And for example, here on the left, you can see that the cold frames have been built on top of a raised bed. So it's going to be pretty easy to build, right? If you had some old windows.
Yeah, any kind of, and they even sell, you know, Home Depot has these small sheets of plastic. You know, all you're doing is building a box that you can stick on top of your raised bed, get some hinges and a frame, and you're in business.
And even if you build and you have some, you know, some old glass windows lying around, you could make your own.
I like that
frame in this way. Yeah, it's kind of really.
That's very farmer.
Yeah, yeah.
Doing what you can with the materials on hand. I like that.
And here's an example of high tunnel. So the difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse is that high tunnels do not have any sort of environmental controls, whereas greenhouses usually do. They usually have heat and ventilation. Well, I guess high tunnels will have ventilation as well, but no fans. And so you can see here to the left is the Lubick's family farm. They had a couple high tunnels where they planted tomatoes very early and so they had an earlier crop of tomatoes earlier than anyone else who would have planted, say, maybe in May. And then to the right here is a really cool concept called the movable tunnel. Brendan, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I haven't actually gotten into that too much, but yeah, so basically it looks like a high tunnel. You've got a Gothic high tunnel, and they have either embedded pipes or rails in the ground. So I guess, yeah, the idea here is, you have a patch of soil where you can start an early planting of something, and then as that starts to grow out, you can move your tunnel right down the row and get multiple uses out of it in the season. Okay,
and lastly, greenhouses. So you may see a lot of these smaller structures in some of your gardening magazines. They're really nice. They're aesthetically pleasing. They may not be as functional as some of the other greenhouses that are covered in plastic. Glass doesn't retain heat as well as plastic does. And then glass is also prone to break. So I wouldn't recommend glass as a greenhouse covering because of these reasons. If you were to use something like a polycarbonate, which is usually a double-walled hard plastic, that will have really good light transmission, and it will keep for up to 10, 15 years, and it won't break. And so other ways that greenhouses differ from these other structures, like I said before, they usually have heaters. And so if you have a smaller greenhouse in your backyard, you don't want to use an indoor heater. You want to use one that's actually recommended for a greenhouse for outside settings. Don't use indoor heaters, and use heaters that are recommended for greenhouses because the indoor heaters won't be able to take the humidity from that a greenhouse usually produces.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about temperature monitoring?
So this is important whether you're using a greenhouse, high tunnel, low tunnel. There are ideal temperatures that most of these plants grow at, so you want to do your best to try to stay within that limit. If you're growing tomatoes, if it gets much more above 90 or 95 degrees, your plants are going to slow down. Your tomatoes not going to ripen as quickly. So, using these protective coverings is great, but it takes a little bit more management. So to help us with that, there's a lot of great thermometer options, all the way from very high-tech systems that are used in greenhouses where you have a sensor that can feed into a computer monitor that can go bounce to your phone with notifications, to what I use. So on the bottom you see this little Govee thermometer. I found this on Amazon and put it in my high tunnel, and it was great. I could check from my phone. It was connected by Bluetooth, so if the temperature got above 95 degrees, I would get an alert on my phone, and I could go out and open up the tunnel. And what's interesting about these things, if you're kind of into the data and science part of this, is all of this information is saved, so you can actually download the temperature history of your entire season and see when the peaks are, see how cold it got certain nights. So if that's your kind of thing, that's fun too. But this hung right in the middle of my high tunnel. It would send me alerts, and it kept me from cooking my plants, which I know without it, I can be awfully forgetful, so I probably would have ended up with stewed tomatoes inside my tunnel if I didn't have this.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really cool little device you have.
Yeah, and they're fairly cheap for these little ones. It tells you temperature, tells you humidity. It was really useful.
Okay, so before you build a structure, whether it be a low tunnel or a high tunnel, you just want to start off small. So just growing slowly and making sure that you can maintain what you have. You also want to consider the best place in your yard to put one of these structures. So, consider trees. You want to make sure that there isn't a whole lot of shade, so you want to look for the sunniest areas of your yard, and observe the light exposure in your yard. So you want to see how the sun moves across your yards, and making sure that, especially with a cold frame, that it's facing in the south direction. So the south-facing cold frame is really going to heat up a lot faster and absorb the most sunlight. You also want to amend your soil at least once a year, so by adding some compost in the spring before you plant, or even when you're planting a new crop, you want to add compost after, say you plant lettuce in the spring. After you keep that lettuce out and before you plant another crop, you want to add more compost to your soil. Then you also want to make a list and gather your materials that you'll need in order to build one of these structures. And also, you want to research plant varieties, so knowing which plants are going to tolerate the heat or tolerate extreme cold, and knowing how long it takes for them to mature. And also planning ahead, so not just thinking about the summer, but thinking about, early in the summer what you want to plant for fall, because a lot of these fall crops need to be planted mid-summer in order to have a late fall or winter harvest. Any other suggestions, Brendan?
No, I mean, yeah, the plan ahead is the number one thing. Have a plan in advance, know what you're doing, when you're going to do it. Get your materials together, make sure you have a good spot. When you're picking out a spot, also keep in mind that a part of your yard that gets 8 hours of sun in the middle of summer might not get that in September. If the sun moves across the horizon and there's trees blocking out, suddenly, your prime summer garden spot might only get 6 hours later in the fall. So, be aware of that and, pay attention to that when you're choosing your location.
Yeah, good point. So, yeah, always thinking at least a season ahead. All right, so let's get into actually growing the crops. So which crops to grow and when? You want to consider your cool season crops versus your warm season crops, and we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. You want to consider either direct seeding or starting your transplants indoors, depending on the time of year. If you're direct seeding, some crops should be direct seeded versus others are better started indoors. Some crops that you want to sow directly into the ground would be your root crops, so things like carrots and radishes and even beets. Beets can be transplanted a little bit easier than, say, carrots or radish. And then also peas would rather be direct seeded. They do a little bit better. So if we're using transplants, things like cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower need to actually be started in early to mid-July in order to grow successfully through the end of the summer into the fall, and that way you'll get a crop in late fall or early winter. And like we mentioned before, if you're considering planting outdoors under one of these structures in the fall, you want to consider planting winter hardy varieties. So there are lettuces that are a little bit more winter hardy and spinach, and you want to look out for those. And if you want to grow things like lettuce in the summer, which can be pretty difficult because they do tend to bolt and produce seed faster in the summer, this Persephone period. And so in our area, it's between November 12th and January 27th. And what that means, it's the shortest day length of the year. So it's 10 hours of daylight and under. So between this period in our area, like I said, November 12th to January 27th, is 10 hours of sunlight or less. And so this is a time where plants are kind of going to go into hibernation a little bit, especially the crops that you're trying to grow in some of these structures, and they're not going to mature. So if you do want to plant crops for winter harvesting, you want to make sure that your plants are at least 75% mature before this period, so before November 12th. So like we said, planting a little bit earlier and counting out the days till harvest before you plant, you'll be able to plan and do your succession planting a little bit better. And Brendan's going to get into succession planting in a little bit. Also, winter harvested crops versus overwintering crops. Winter harvested crops usually are planted in midsummer to early fall, and you can harvest those crops in the winter. Whereas overwintering crops are usually planted later in the fall or in the winter, usually by transplants that are started indoors or in a greenhouse. And so those overwintering crops will be some of the first crops that you harvest in the spring. So depending on what you want to do and how you want to harvest, then you're really going to want to plan out, what to plant when. And like I had mentioned before, considering your days to harvest. So things that grow very quickly are your things like radish and lettuce and spinach and sometimes beets. Beets are about like 50 to 60 days. So when you're looking at seeds to grow, you really want to make sure that those days to harvest will match up with your planting days and, before the Persephone period. And so, that's another really important thing to look for. And anything else to add to that, Brendan?
Yeah, just, keeping in mind also with your days to harvest, in New Jersey, I think the first frost date in the fall is around October 15th, so that doesn't mean it will frost then, but it means past that point, you're kind of in the danger zone. So if you are planning stuff for fall harvest, while you're doing that planning, keep in mind mid-October and on, you also need to be incorporating these other techniques. You need to have the row cover at the ready or the hoop house at the ready, and you need to keep an eye on the weather because after that point it could get cold very quickly. One other thing with direct seeding too, especially if you're going to be summer planting for fall harvest, pay attention on the seed packets. A lot of them will have germination temperatures where if the soil is outside of a certain temperature range, the seed won't germinate. And for a lot of colder weather stuff like your lettuces and your spinach, if the temperature of the soil is much above 70 degrees, you might plant it in July or August, but it might just not grow on you. So that's another argument for why some of that stuff you're going to need to start indoors where you can control how cool that soil is and then transplant outside because your seeds just won't work if it's too hot.
That's a really good point. If you wanted to cool down the soil, you could use something like a shade cloth that would help lower the temperature of the soil as well. Do you want to talk about early and late planting?
Yeah, so don't be defined by frost dates. Keep them in mind because they are important. But picking veggies that don't mind the frost so much, your brassicas, your kale, cabbage, broccoli, collards are very, very cold tolerant. Spinach and lettuce are going to be moderately tolerant. Peas tend to do better when it's colder. They're not necessarily going to love frost, but, that early in the season, end of the season, peas can do well. But starting these things, again, you're going to want to have, like your kale and collards and broccoli, you're going to want to be able to transplant those out. So that means starting your seeds back in February or even March, and then starting seeds indoors again, July, August, September, to avoid that overly hot soil. And also planting things that you can overwinter, which Angela already mentioned. And, for instance, garlic is one that you want to plant in the fall. And we're going to have a show on garlic coming up in a few weeks that I'm going to tune in for because I want to plant some garlic. And strawberries are actually another one that's great to plant this time of year. I just planted mine last weekend, and here they are. And here we're using a couple techniques we've talked about. We've got the mulch down. I've taken the plastic mulch cloth is stapled directly to my raised beds. Got strawberries about 10 to 12 inch spacing. So these are going to overwinter right in the ground. And what's really nice about this black mulch is that soil in that bed is going to heat up early. The strawberry plants are going to start to grow before they would if they were, say, in open soil. And I'm going to be able to get a jump start on that strawberry harvesting come end of May, early June. And I'll even go out, probably sometime in, April, probably early April, and I'll start putting some row cover down on these just to give them a little extra bump of warmth and kind of stimulate them growing.
And I think something that we probably didn't mention is irrigation under this black plastic mulch. Yeah, so I can kind of see, I don't know, maybe people in the audience can see as well, but there's kind of, I see maybe 2 drip lines here, Brendan. Yep. I can see 2 raised bumps in the plastic where it looks like you have your irrigation.
Yeah, so I've got, drip line runs under this. There's two, one that runs next to each row of berries. And again, because you don't necessarily have the same rainfall to rely on since you've covered the ground with plastic, so it's important to have that drip irrigation under there. But the other advantage is for disease control because you're not overhead watering these. So they're not going to be in contact with soil. Your berries aren't going to be in contact with soil. And you're going to avoid a lot of the kind of mold and detritus issues that you would get if you were just growing strawberries on the ground.
Okay, and so just to kind of review what cool season crops are, these are plants that have adapted to cool climates. They usually prefer temperatures around 70 degrees or below, and they will generally thrive at temperatures 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees, lower than preferred by warm season crops. And so a lot of them will germinate in soils between 40 and 45 degrees. And as you can see here, your brassicas, so brassicas are a plant family. So they include your cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, collards. Also, leafy greens are cool season crops, such as your lettuce and your chard. Beets, radish, carrots, peas are all cool season crops. And then warm season crops are plants that have adapted to warmer climates, such as tomatoes, peppers, beans, cucumbers, eggplant, melons, squash, both winter and summer squash, and corn. And so it's funny because I feel like a lot of people think that you want to plant pumpkins in the fall, but actually you want to plant pumpkins in May and June so that you can harvest them. So they usually like to germinate when soils are about 75 degrees. Okay. Oh, real quick, we talked about this a little bit, direct seeding versus transplants. Here are some master gardeners in the garden. So to the left, we have Bosco, and she is using a seeder to direct seed a larger area. You can do this in your own garden if you have a flat surface. And then also to the right, we have some master gardeners planting brassica crops there. And so they're using transplants to plant into the ground.
And again, seed packets are your best friend. All the information you need to know is right on the back there. Read it and follow it, and you will be happy. They will tell you whether that seed is best for the ground, best for direct seed, best for transplant, how and when to do both, all your spacings. There's a lot of information on those, so pay attention. So succession planting, actually, if you want to back up one, I wanted to mention some of that's on there. So for succession planting, it's all about timing your plantings, and instead of having one big flush of crops, spacing it out throughout the season, because summer veggies are great and you want to have them for as long as possible. So these are actually some pictures from my own garden, and the tomatoes that you see in that first, second, and last picture, I'm still harvesting now. The tomatoes in the second picture, I just picked this morning. So, by spacing out, making sure that you're planting at different times, you keep that harvest going. So you can still have fresh tomatoes. I'll probably be picking my tomatoes right up till frost, and that's the way I like it. So, we've all had this problem. I had it plenty of times when I was, new to gardening, where you go out May 15th, you stick every plant you can in every square foot of ground that you can get to, and then all of a sudden, sometime in July, you have 1 or 2 weeks where everything's harvesting and you have tons of vegetables and it's way more than you can eat, and all of a sudden it's just done. So the way to avoid this, and this is what farmers do, and it is succession planting, leaving slots of your ground open, as hard as that is sometimes. And knowing that in another 3-4 weeks, you're going to put in another planting. So you want to work backwards from that last frost date, October 15th, like I mentioned, and really plan out when do you want to have vegetables, what are your harvest times for the different things you're planting. If you do something that's early season, like a lettuce or a broccoli, when you're done harvesting that, pull that out and reuse that ground. So where my spinach and lettuce were in the spring, I pulled that out and replanted butternut squash in that spot. So now I have tons of butternut squash that are coming ready right about now. And where my cabbage was for the spring, I pulled that out and replanted with tomatoes. So, tomatoes is a great example. Plant, instead of 10 tomato plants right at the beginning of the season, plant 5, wait another 4 or 6 weeks, and plant 5 more. And that way you're going to stagger that out, and you're going to keep having fresh produce to pick all season long. And this is just kind of a spreadsheet that shows, if you want to review later, all these slides will be available. So you can take a look at this, and it kind of gives you an idea of the months and what you can be planting at different times of the year for succession planting.
Elliot Coleman is great. So he has a book called Four Season Harvest. If you want to get into this more, he goes into a lot more detail. It's an amazing book, so I would highly recommend that. Also, Johnny Seeds has a lot of really good resources as far as, extending your garden season, learning about particular crops and how to grow them. I would definitely recommend the Johnny Seed website.
Johnny Seeds is like the best compendium of plant information.
They're wonderful.
They're so good.
And then Rutgers has a couple fact sheets on vegetable gardening and planting a vegetable garden. We just want to thank our freeholders at Middlesex County, Don Rios and the crew in supporting all of our programming. They really support us a lot at the Earth Center, and they encourage us to deliver information like this to everybody, and you guys get to reap the benefits. One question from JD was asking about Asian greens, whether they are a warm season crop or cool season crop. And I was saying that they're a cool season crop, and they tend to be in the mustard and brassica families. So I was recommending to cover them with row cover because flea beetles and cabbage moths will devour them. Shira is asking about the electrical conduit, and she was asking if we should use the 1/2 inch by 10 foot.
Yes, 1/2 inch by 10 foot is the way to go. That's what most of the, if you buy one of those benders, that's what they recommend. They can be used with 3/4 as well, but 1/2 inch is all that you need. It's more than enough, and yeah, the 1/2 inch by 10.
And Vani is asking about, she wants to have raised beds on her deck. How does she go about that?
The most important thing there, I think, is going to be drainage, just making sure that the water has somewhere to go, so you're not like rotting out the deck underneath the bed. So, I mean, if you're putting it on the edge and you can, just having like a pan underneath that can kind of drain the water off. But make sure, I guess if you're doing raised beds on the deck, be careful that the deck can handle the load of it as well. I do smaller beds, if anything, because the weight in those can add up very quick with the weight of soil and water and plants. So just make sure it's something that your deck can structurally handle before you put it up. So
Neil is asking about, would she be able to bend the electrical conduit without the actual bender?
It will be very tricky. The bender, the design of the bender allows you to gradually bend the pipe. If you built a form, you could. So if you had like a sheet of plywood and you could stack a couple sheets of plywood that you kind of cut an arc into, you could probably bend it across that. But you will need some kind of form, or you'll probably end up just kinking the conduit.
Lisa is asking, how long into the season will eggplant grow? Usually till frost. I mean,
yep.
If you get a hard frost, it'll be done. So maybe mid-October. And Barbara is also asking about whether cabbage moths have a season, or are they just always around?
As far as I'm aware, they're just always there.
Yeah, they really do. They have quite a few, growing stages where, what is it called? They just keep producing.
Yeah, row covers are your best friend for dealing with. And the thing is, though, you got to be careful because the row cover tears so easily, and they will, if there's a hole, they'll find it.
Hello, guys.
Oh, hey, Bill.
Hey, I just wanted to comment that this year we had a pretty severe problem with heat impact on certain vegetables, cucurbits, certain heirlooms, where we just simply didn't get the production, reaction of pollen, and also in the case of some cucurbits where we're getting more male flowers. So this was a tough year for plants in general, for some areas, more so than others. So utilizing the techniques that Angela and Brendan shared with you today, but by using row covers and by shading some of these greens even in the afternoon a little bit more, and using the row covers, you can actually get a little more life out of these plants and have them go in further into the season. But we did have quite a few problems with the heat index being so high, and if the heat stays high in the evening, what happens, that impacts actual pollination itself and your overall yield. So good job, guys.
We had one other question from Lisa in the chat. Do you recommend a liner at the bottom of the raised bed? I'm not sure if you mean like a landscape liner. For the bottom of the raised bed, the only two things I recommend using are the cardboard, a cardboard layer to take care of any leaves or grass at the bottom, and a layer of hardware cloth if you're concerned about burrowing pests. I wouldn't worry about using like landscape cloth or plastic liner. That's not necessary, and it could interfere with root growth if your bed's shallow. And what was the name of the book that you mentioned, For Season Growing?
Yeah, Joe had asked. So Elliot Coleman is the author, and I was saying he has quite a few books that talk about season extension and just growing in general. And there are also some YouTube videos out there of him speaking, and yeah, he's just amazing. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, for all your great questions, and hope to see everyone again next week.
Take care. Have a good night.